The box was small enough to sit on a car seat without anyone asking about it. Inside were shoes, gray suede, handmade, size 5.5. He had bought them in Paris. He had carried them through an occupied country for a woman who did not know they existed. They were a birthday present. Just before 7 that morning, he walked out of a chateau on the Seine. 52 years old, gray at the temples, sleeping 4 hours a night, and furious about tanks. Erwin Rommel. Behind him lay a coastline he had spent 6 months rebuilding. He had ordered more than 4 million mines buried under those beaches. He had driven his own staff to exhaustion doing it, and he had told them one thing until they stopped arguing with him. The invasion would be decided in the first 24 hours. Not the first week, not the campaign, the first day. Inside 48 hours, 5,000 ships would come out of that gray weather. 156,000 men would land on sand he had walked himself. The one German commander who understood the clock would be 600 kilometers away. At home, with a shoebox. Here is the part nobody expects. Leaving was the reasonable decision. Rommel had come to France in December 1943 to inspect a wall. German propaganda called it the Atlantic Wall. He found something else. In some sectors, the concrete was real, thick, and finished. In others, there was wire, paperwork, and a great deal of nothing. That January, he took command of Army Group B. His responsibility ran from the Dutch coast down to the Loire. 2 armies and roughly 1,000 kilometers of shoreline. 50-odd divisions, most of them static, many of them worn out or filled with foreign conscripts. Some units on that coast had no transport beyond bicycles and farm carts. Whole battalions were made up of men captured in the east and put back into German uniform. Their officers did not trust them and did not pretend otherwise. Rommel toured all of it that winter, sector by sector, in appalling weather. He shouted at engineers. He inspected latrines and ammunition returns and rates of fire. The staff who traveled with him described the pace as punishing. Most senior German officers expected the blow at Pas-de-Calais. It was the shortest crossing. It was the fastest road to the Ruhr. Rommel half believed that too, and he hedged anyway. There was a second reason the Germans watched the calendar as closely as the map. An invasion needed a late-rising moon for the airborne drops. It needed a low tide at dawn so the engineers could see the obstacles. Those two conditions came together only a few days a month. He had already fought the British and the Americans in the desert. He knew what their aircraft did to a column of tanks in daylight. That knowledge shaped every order he gave on this coast. If the Allies got ashore and stayed ashore, the war in the West was finished. So he built downward, into the sand. Mines, obstacles, stakes driven into the fields behind the dunes. The wall was not finished. It would never be finished, and he knew it better than anyone in Berlin. But the gap that killed the German defense was not a hole in the concrete. It was in the chain of command. And a second absence was already being scheduled. That one cost Germany more than he did. By the first days of June, a trap was set on both sides of the channel. Only one side knew which trap it was standing in. Rommel wanted 50 million mines. That was the number he actually asked for. He got somewhere between 4 and 6 million of them into the ground. Along parts of the Normandy coast, the density was extraordinary. Behind the dunes, his men flooded the low fields and the river valleys. In the open meadows, they planted poles, wired together, some tipped with shells. The troops called them Rommel's spargel. Rommel's asparagus. He worked the obstacle belt down through the tide lines, one row at a time. Ramps to flip landing craft. Steel hedgehogs welded from rail iron. Timber stakes with mines lashed to the top of them. Every one was built by hand, by soldiers and requisitioned civilians. None of them knew how long they had. Fight the battle at the waterline, not inland. His reasoning came from Africa, not from a staff college. Allied fighter bombers would tear apart any reserve that moved in daylight. So the reserves had to sit close enough to hit the beach on the first morning. He understood it and accepted it. Tanks parked near the coast could be pinned by naval gunfire and wasted on a feint. On 6 June, the only division that counterattacked was one he had pushed forward. On the 22nd of April, he said it plainly to his aide, Captain Helmuth Long. The first 24 hours would decide everything. For both sides, he told Long, it would be the longest day. 15 years later, a book took its title from that sentence. He had built the ground. But minds do not move. The thing that could throw an invasion back into the sea had tracks, and it did not belong to him. There were roughly 10 panzer divisions in the west. Rommel wanted them at the coast. General Leo Gier von Schweppenberg commanded Panzer Group West and disagreed completely. Gier had fought in Russia. He wanted the armor massed inland, held back, then thrown at the beachhead in one blow. 2 men, 2 doctrines, 1 coast. Rommel argued that Gier's tanks would never arrive at all. Allied aircraft would find them on the roads and kill them there. Gier argued that armor tied to the beaches would be shot to pieces by naval guns. Both men were right, and that was the problem. This was not a polite disagreement between colleagues. Rommel went over Gier's head and took the argument to Berchtesgaden in person. He got a hearing, and he got a compromise, which in this case meant he got nothing. Hitler split the difference between them. He would not overrule either commander, and he wanted no single point of failure. A divided armored reserve with nobody on the ground able to release it. 3 panzer divisions went to Rommel, the 2nd, the 21st, the 116th. 4 more sat under OKBU control, released only on Hitler's personal authority. The rest went south to Army Group G. Read that arrangement again as a viewer, not as a historian. The most dangerous weakness in Normandy was not a gap in the wall. It was a telephone line running to a mountain house in Bavaria. Rommel understood this more clearly than any man alive, which is exactly why he was driving to Germany. The shoes explain the date he chose. They do not explain the trip. He wanted to stand in front of Hitler and argue for more armor. He never got the meeting. German forecasting in 1944 had a hole in it the size of the Atlantic. Weather in Western Europe arrives from the west. To predict it, you need observations far out in the ocean. The Kriegsmarine had lost most of its weather ships. Allied and Norwegian raids had rolled up the Greenland stations one by one. U-boats reported when they could, which was less and less often. The Allies, meanwhile, had that ocean covered. On the morning of the 4th of June, Colonel Professor Walter Steinpe issued his report from Paris. He was the Luftwaffe's chief meteorologist in France. His 5 o'clock forecast promised thickening clouds, rising wind, and rain. A 20 to 30 mile-an-hour blow was already running in the channel. The Kriegsmarine canceled its patrol boats that night. Nobody was going to sea in that. Air reconnaissance stayed on the ground. That mattered more than anything else the Germans failed to do that week. For 3 days, nobody flew over the southern English ports. Had a single aircraft gone up and come back, the ports would have told them everything. Thousands of ships were sitting in plain daylight along that coast. The next workable combination of moon and tide looked like the middle of the month. Rommel left for Germany just before 7 that morning. His own meteorologist told him a landing was impossible for days. If the forecast was wrong, the commander of the entire coastal front was out of reach. He drove away barely 2 hours after Eisenhower postponed the invasion. Neither man knew a thing about the other. Lucie Rommel's 50th birthday fell on the 6th. The Berghoff appointment could be arranged for the 8th. The arithmetic was clean, and it was wrong. Then the line went quiet. Because one weather report in the world said something different. For 80 years, the argument has run in the same groove. Would Rommel have stopped the invasion if he had been there? It is the wrong question. Ask a harder one. What could Rommel actually have done at 6 in the morning on the 6th of June? He could not release the 12th SS. Panzer Lehr was not his to move either. Those divisions answered to a headquarters in East Prussia and a man asleep in Bavaria. He had already lost that argument in the spring. The absence everyone remembers was a symptom. The disease was a command system that needed one man's signature to fight a battle. And that man was asleep. His absence made a terrible morning worse. It did not create the morning. Which leaves one question for the rest of this story to answer. If the tanks were never really his, what was the trip for? A Scottish meteorologist was losing an argument in a library in Hampshire. Group Captain James Stagg had one job and no good options. 6 forecasters, 2 nationalities, and a permanent disagreement between them. The Americans read the data one way, the British read it another. Stagg had to turn all of that noise into one sentence for one man. He had no satellites, no radar picture of the Atlantic, no computer model, no ocean of data. He had ship reports, aircraft reports, and a wall of pressure charts drawn by hand. 2 days was the practical limit of any forecast he could give. At 4:15 on the morning of the 4th of June, he gave Eisenhower bad news. A deep Atlantic depression was driving straight into the channel. The landing craft would swamp. Aircraft would be blind. Naval gunnery would be spotting for nothing. Eisenhower postponed. Convoys already at sea had to be turned around in a rising gale. That evening, Stagg came back with something nobody in the room expected. Between 2 storm systems, he had found a gap. Roughly 36 hours of barely adequate weather arriving on the 6th. Not good weather, survivable weather. Everything rested on that one judgment. Postpone again, and the tides pushed the operation to the middle of June. Postpone that long, and the secret would not hold, and the men would come off the ships. Eisenhower paced. Nobody in that library spoke for several long minutes. Then he said 4 words that launched the largest amphibious operation in history. "Okay, we'll go." At 4:15 on the 5th, Stagg confirmed the forecast, and the order stood. 600 kilometers east, a field marshal slept in his own bed for the first time in months. He had been overtaken by a weather map he would never see. The Germans had missed the gap completely. That was not carelessness. It was blind, and it had been built patiently over 3 years. Stagg was right, and he stayed right. Weeks later, he sent Eisenhower a note about the weather that followed. The middle of June brought the worst channel storm in 20 years. It wrecked one of the artificial harbors and drove hundreds of craft ashore. Had the invasion waited for the tides, it would have sailed into that. The house at Herrlingen sat outside Ulm, on a slope with a garden. The family had moved in the previous October. Lucie liked it. Manfred was 15 and already serving on an anti-aircraft battery. For most of 5 years, these 3 people had lived on letters. Rommel arrived on the evening of the 4th after a long drive. The 5th was quiet. He walked in the garden with Lucie. It was the first quiet day he had taken in months. He telephoned about the Berghoff appointment and got nowhere useful. What he intended to ask Hitler for was specific. 2 more panzer divisions moved into Normandy, a brigade of mortars, an anti-aircraft corps. He had the maps in the car with him. There is a detail here that most tellings skip past. The shoes and the tanks were the same trip. Herrlingen was on the road to Berchtesgaden, and the birthday made the timing tidy. He was not abandoning his post for a present. He was going to fight for his armored reserve and stopped at home on the way. While he walked in that garden, the largest fleet ever assembled was forming up in the channel. 5,000 ships, nearly 12,000 aircraft, men sealed into marshalling camps for days, seasick before they had even sailed. On her birthday morning, he gave her the shoes. Gray suede, size 5.5. The paratroopers had already been on the ground for hours. He was not the only German commander in the wrong place that night. He was not even the most consequential one. Back at La Roche-Guyon that same evening, his chief of staff hosted a dinner party. Hans Speidel had invited his brother-in-law and the writer Ernst Junger. They talked about literature and philosophy in a room above the scene. The invasion fleet was already at sea while that table was being cleared. General Friedrich Dahlmann commanded the 7th Army, which held Normandy. He had scheduled a map exercise at Rennes for the morning of the 6th. The scenario for that exercise was an enemy landing supported by airborne troops. Divisional commanders were ordered to attend, each bringing 2 regimental commanders with him. Dahlmann's own chief of staff was uneasy about the whole thing. He teleprinted the divisions and told them not to travel before daylight. Several of them went anyway. General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben of the 709th left on the afternoon of the 5th. General Wilhelm Falley of the 91st Air Landing Division drove off at nightfall. Falley said something to his operations officer before he went. "Nothing's going to happen in this lousy weather. Now count what is missing from the Normandy front on that night. The Army Group Commander is in Germany. The Army Commander is in Rennes. Divisional commanders are on the road in the dark. And the commander of the 21st Panzer Division is not at his headquarters either. Fally would be dead within 9 hours. Not from the weather he had trusted. The Germans were not blind on the 5th of June. One man saw it coming, and the warning stopped at his own army boundary. Lieutenant Colonel Helmuth Meyer ran the intelligence section of the 15th Army. His people had a listening post at Tourcoing near the Belgian border. For months they had been sifting BBC broadcasts for coded messages to the French resistance. They knew what to listen for. A line from a 19th century French poem split into two halves. The first half meant the invasion was coming. The second half meant it was coming inside 48 hours. They caught the first half on the 1st of June. On the evening of the 5th at 9:15, they caught the second. Meyer knew exactly what he was holding. He alerted his own headquarters, and the 15th Army went to full alert. Then the warning ran into the seam between two armies. The 15th held the Pas de Calais. The 7th held Normandy. The 7th Army never went on alert that night. Nobody in the Cotentin was told. The right message reached the wrong headquarters in the wrong sector on the last available evening. Meyer went to bed with the invasion warning in his hand. Roughly 3 hours later, the gliders came down at Benouville. It is 16 minutes past midnight. 6 gliders come down beside a canal bridge east of Caen. 10 minutes later, the bridge belongs to the British. Along the Cotentin, American paratroopers land everywhere except where they intend to. Cloud, flak, and scattered drops throw them across 30 miles of hedgerow. The confusion works in their favor. German reports arrive from too many places at once to make any pattern. At Vimont, southeast of Caen, Major Hans von Luke is awake. He commands a Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division. His men are bringing him captured paratroopers. He has tanks, assault guns, fuel, and a clear picture of what is happening. He asks for permission to attack. His divisional commander is not at his headquarters. The staff will not act without him. So von Luck's regiment sits where it is and listens to the sky. The nearest armored division to the beaches spends the decisive hours waiting for a telephone call. At 1:15, 7th Army headquarters declares a state of alarm. By 2, paratroop reports are stacking up across 2 core sectors. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt is 68 years old and awake. He commands everything in the west and controls almost nothing. He looks at the map and reaches the right conclusion within hours. This is the invasion. He asks OKW to release the armored reserve. The request goes to General Alfred Jodl. Jodl says no. The Frere has not decided, and the Frere is asleep. Understand exactly what is being refused here. 2 panzer divisions sit within a day's march of the beaches. Panzer Lehr is among the best-equipped armored divisions in the German army. The 12th SS is roughly 50 miles from the coast. Both of them need one signature. Nobody at the Berghof will wake Hitler. Jodl believes Normandy may be a feint. He believes the real blow is still coming at Pas de Calais. That belief is not stupidity. It is the exact product Allied deception has spent 18 months manufacturing. Rundstedt orders the divisions forward anyway, on his own authority. At 6 in the morning, OKW cancels his order. The tanks stop where they stand. In Herrlingen, the telephone rings. Speidel is on the line from La Roche-Guyon. Rommel listens. There is nothing useful he can say from a house in Swabia. He orders his car brought round and his maps repacked. Lang, standing close by, hears him repeat the same 4 words over and over. How stupid of me. Dawn comes at 5:30, and the horizon is not empty. Men in the bunkers above Vierville see ships where the sea used to be. There is no counting them. The bombardment starts, and for a while it looks decisive. It is not. At Omaha, the heavy bombers release seconds late through cloud and put their loads inland. Some of the fields behind the bluffs are cratered. The bunkers on the bluffs are untouched. At 6:30, the first Americans reach the sand at Omaha. The current has pushed them east of where they should be. The bombers have missed the bunkers entirely. In one sector, 29 swimming tanks go into the swell. 27 of them sink. Machine guns firing along the beach cover its whole length. Men lie behind a bank of shingle because there is nowhere else on earth to go. 3 miles of coastline are doing precisely what Rommel promised they would do. His defense is working exactly as designed at Omaha. It is working nowhere else. By 9 in the morning, American engineers are blowing gaps through the obstacle belt. They are doing it under fire, standing up, with the tide coming in behind them. Small groups start climbing the draws. The line that was supposed to hold for a day holds for a morning. A destroyer captain brings his ship in until she is almost touching bottom. He fires at the bluffs over open sights. By noon, there are Americans in the fields above the beach. Behind them, the sand is still a shooting gallery. It no longer matters. At Utah, the landing craft drift south and come ashore against weaker positions. Gold, Juno, and Sword get over the wall and into the villages behind it. By mid-morning, the beaches had failed as a defensive line. The Germans still hold ground inland, and that is a different battle. The clock Rommel talked about for 6 months is running. Nobody with the authority to stop it is awake. It is 9:30 in the morning on the 6th of June. Hitler is still asleep. Hitler took his situation report around midday. By several accounts, he was in a good mood about it. Release of the reserve came in the afternoon. The 12th SS received its movement order at 2:30. Panzer-Lehr got moving later still. Both divisions now had to cross Normandy in daylight. That was the precise thing Rommel had spent 6 months warning them about. Fighter bombers found the columns on the roads. Panzer-Lehr lost vehicles, fuel tankers, and hours it could never replace. Its commander later described the road march as a nightmare of burning columns and constant diving aircraft. The division arrived in the battle already damaged, having fought nothing. That was the whole of Rommel's argument, demonstrated in a single afternoon. Only one armored division counterattacked on the 6th of June. Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski took his tanks north in the afternoon. Part of the division reached the sea at Luc-sur-Mer. For a short time, a German force stood in the gap between Juno and Sword. Then they looked up. Behind them, in the evening light, the second wave of British gliders was coming in. 250 of them landing across the ground he would have to withdraw through. Oppeln-Bronikowski broke off and pulled back. He judged himself about to be cut off by a fresh airborne division, giving up the only German position that actually touched the invasion beaches. The corridor closed, and no German unit reached that coast again. Von Luck finally got his orders that afternoon. His regiment attacked east of the river toward the bridges taken at midnight. He was about 16 hours late. The paratroopers were dug in by then and would not be shifted. He fought over that same ground for the next 2 months. Fally never made it back to his headquarters. American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne ambushed his car near Picoville. He was killed beside it, a few hundred yards from his own command post. The war game had been about an imaginary landing. He died coming back from it, into a real one. Rommel left Herrlingen that morning and simply drove. Lang sat beside him. 600 kilometers of German and French road, and he barely spoke on any of it. He had spent half a year telling everyone the first day was everything. He spent the first day in a car. It was late at night when the tow came into view. Speidel met him at the door. The situation map had already been redrawn. By then, the Allies had put roughly 156,000 men ashore. 5 beachheads, not yet joined together and not going to be pushed back. He stood in front of the map and did what commanders do. He gave orders for a counterattack he already knew was far too late. The window he had described so exactly had opened and shut while he was on the road. The 6th of June cost the Allies around 10,000 casualties. Over 4,000 of them were dead. German losses that day are harder to pin down. Estimates run from 4,000 to 9,000. And there is a third column that usually gets left off the page. French civilians died in their thousands in Normandy that week. Around 3,000 were killed on the 6th and 7th alone, mostly by Allied bombing. Caen burned. So did St. El. The people being liberated paid a bill nobody had shown them in advance. By the end of the campaign, the figure for Normandy alone ran to about 20,000 civilians. They lie in the same soil as the soldiers. Some of their villages were never rebuilt in the same shape. Rommel fought the Normandy campaign for 6 more weeks. He fought it exactly as he had predicted he would, reacting, always late, always under an air force he could not answer. On the 17th of July, his staff car was stranded near Saint-Foy de Montgomery. His driver was hit and the car went off the road. Rommel fractured his skull and was carried out unconscious. 3 days later, a bomb went off under Hitler's map table in East Prussia. The investigation reached Rommel through officers on his own staff. On the 14th of October, 2 generals arrived at the house in Herrlingen. They brought a letter and a choice. He told Lucie and Manfred what was about to happen. He put on the leather coat he had worn in Africa. Then he walked out to the car. He was 52 years old, and he died within sight of his own village. Lucie Rommel kept the shoes. 15 years after the invasion, an American reporter came to Germany. Cornelius Ryan was writing a book about a single day. He interviewed the widow, the son, and the aide who had been in the car. Lang remembered the size without being asked. 5.5. And Frau Rommel went and fetched them. She still had them, 15 years on. They had not been thrown away. They had been worn enough to need resolving. That is what survived. Not the doctrine, not the wall, not the argument about where to put the tanks. A pair of gray suede shoes resold in a house near Ulm. He was right about the 24 hours, right about the air, and right about the tanks. He was 600 kilometers away when it started, and he never stopped knowing it. If you want more of these, the hours the war actually turned on, then subscribe. We tell them from inside the rooms where they were lost. Send it to whoever taught you this history in the first place. That is how the names stay in the record. Von Luck came home from a Soviet labor camp in 1950. He wrote his account down because he thought somebody ought to. The invasion lasted a day. He had been carrying that box for a week.